Infinity's combat remotes are a series of unit archetypes that have been around long enough to almost be considered ubiquitous. They're available to every faction and are, in fact, so ubiquitous that I almost never mention them in any of my faction focused videos. This video aims to rectify that. And so in this video, we'll be talking about the humble remote profiles that are available to most factions. That's Flash Pulse remotes, Baggage remotes, Forward Observer remotes, Total Reaction remotes, and Guided Missile remotes. We'll talk about what they're for, how to use them, when to include them in lists, make occasional mention of where there are faction-specific exceptions, but generally this is a companion video to all of my faction focus series. I basically never mention these series of units in those videos because every faction has access to them and I'd be repeating myself constantly, but they're absolutely worth talking about. And so big thanks to channel supporter Shogun0099 for the request. It's a good choice of topic and I'm happy to be talking about it today. On that note, just as a quick plug, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so either via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Now let's start with that humblest of remote, the Flash Pulse remote. These are Fugazi, Chayai, Transductors, etc., and these things are universally 7 points for a regular order. They'll have got 6/6 move, no armor, and 3 BTS. They're silhouette 3, which does differentiate them, for example, from baggage bots, and they've got a few important skills. Those most important skills are Mimetism and access to a repeater, and they have no lethal weapons. They've got only Flash Pulses and Paras CCWs. Although with that Mimetism and Willpower 13, they're not completely excluded from undertaking some light combat duties. Now, every faction's got access to these just about of varying availabilities. Availability 1 through AVA 3, depending on the faction that you're playing. And these guys serve a few different purposes. The obvious and most important one is that this is just a 7-point regular order. That is almost as cheap as it gets for regular orders in Infinity. There are a very, very small number of exceptions, things like Imitrons and Netrods, and then characters with inspiring leadership. But generally speaking, this is going to be the cheapest you can get for a regular order. Now that's reasonably valued by itself. Usually in Infinity, you want to hit 15 troopers. You want to have a good count of regular orders to fuel those troopers, and with only 300 points, you've got an average of 20 points to spend per trooper. If you spend 7 points on one of your regular orders, that frees up 13 points in your list towards that count to help make something else in the army more powerful. Now, by itself, that would make these Flash Pulse remotes good, but they've got a bunch of other things that we can use them for and which make them valuable as well. The first of those is just that they are a model with a repeater that's going to be sitting somewhere, usually safe, prone in your deployment zone. Repeaters have a wide area of interest, and usually something like 3 repeaters or hacking areas in your deployment zone is enough to give you pretty good coverage of your DZ and the approaches to your DZ, which helps make hacking a defense against intrusions into your deployment zone. Now, not every faction has access to hacking, although every faction with access to these remotes does. And even a low investment like well, actually these days Panoceania can invest quite a lot in hacking, but a low investment defensive hacking network, even something as simple as like a single blocker hacker, plus a couple of Fugazi drone bots, gives you just a tool for helping to defend against intrusions into your deployment zone from models like, for example, Sujan, who are otherwise very, very dangerous. That's valuable. And with 6/6 move, you're actually not too badly off if you occasionally have to use Fugazi drone bots, for example, as part of a coordinated order or even just as a combat group 2 order to move your repeater area forward. But there's other uses for these drone bots as well. We can use this Flash Pulse as an arrow if we're cautious about doing so. One of the mistakes, and I think this is a mistake, that I will see new to intermediate players do sometimes is just to put Fugazi drone bots up as ARO pieces because they're willpower 13 with a Flash Pulse and Mimetism. Now, relative to their cost, yes, these guys actually are kind of durable. Mimetism is a good defensive skill. They've got a 8 to 24-inch good range band on the Flash Pulse, hitting on 13s. And they're even surprisingly okay at dodging thanks to Fizz 14, which is something that will set them apart from most other remotes. But I do think it's a mistake to just put these things up as generic hard-ish ARO pieces. This isn't like a war call, for example, where it's expendable, it's important, it's a regular order. And even a war call I would be relatively conservative with these days because there's just a lot of guns in Infinity N5 that are very good at putting down pieces like a Fugazi drone bot. Tags, Elite heavy infantry, smoke shooting is very appealing. Basically, every list that I've written for a while now has got at least some way of very efficiently putting these things down, and because a Fugazi Dronbot is a regular order, your opponent is actually getting a pretty good return on investment by spending one or two orders to kill any Fugazis and other Flash Pulse remotes that you put up as ARO pieces. Instead, there's kind of two roles that we might use a Fugazi or equivalent for. The first is as what we'll call a picket ARO piece. A picket in this case being more focused on those deployment zone approaches than longer range AROs. You can nook these things into little positions in your deployment zone where they don't watch all the way into the midfield, but they watch the close approaches to your DZ. Where something like McMurrough, for example, or a Sujan might have to move multiple times, and then only at the terminal approach to your deployment zone do you start getting to make flash pulse remotes with these Fugazis. What that does is that it keeps your drone bots safe from long range heavy firepower, and it gives you an ARO that might just stop a very, very dangerous attack after your opponent has already spent a bunch of orders moving the offensive piece forward. Now, that doesn't give you a higher chance of success, for example, flash pulsing McMurrough, but it does mean that if you succeed, the cost to your opponent is much, much higher because they've invested all of this time moving a piece all the way up towards your deployment zone, only to have it stopped at the very end of that approach. So they've invested multiple orders, that's a cost, and the model is now much closer to you for a counterattack and relatively helpless, which means they have to spend more orders if they want to pull it back to safety. Again, this doesn't increase your likelihood of successfully landing a flash pulse on a piece that's assaulting your deployment zone, but it does increase the risk on your opponent by increasing the consequences to them if you succeed. So that's useful. You can just kind of remember that these guys have got that rule. You can also make very good use of these things as picket flash pulses, actually just watching inside your deployment zone. A very common use of this kind of piece for me is to put it literally touching my back table edge facing forward so that it can see my entire back table edge that isn't blocked by terrain. And I can use it to flash pulse things like parachutist deployment zones that are arriving and help ward off pieces like that. So the flash pulse is a valuable ARO. You just want to use it in a way where you're getting the most value out of it and not just exposing the drone bot to death. Now, sometimes you don't have a lot of choice and you just have to make the judgment call that actually maybe your deployment zone is terrible, maybe the terrain on the map is awful, maybe you're playing on a parking lot or a two-fort map, maybe you just don't think you've got any other option because of pieces that you know your opponent is going to be using. Sometimes you just have to use these things as ARO pieces. If you're going to do that, we've got a note here about the 33-inch ARO of Desperation. And what that means is that the Flash Pulse range band, yes, it's nominally good from 8 to 24, but it drops off to -3 and stays at -3 all the way out to 48 inches, which means if you're being opposed by heavy machine guns, you can actually put your Fugazi drone bot far back in your deployment zone on an active ARO piece kind of position and force a -3 range not just onto yourself, but also onto your opponent's HMG. And if you're facing down something like a tactical armored gear with a multi-HMG, like a Squalos, for example, you can put -9 onto that Squalos from range and cover and mimetism, which means that it's hitting on 6s, and if you just sit there dodging on 11s, actually it can take a very long time for a piece like a Squalos to dislodge a sniper-positioned Flash Pulse remote. Now, you only want to do that when you think you have no other choice. Because ultimately, most factions will have some kind of gun that can dislodge the Fugazi drone bot. But I have played games, I have been the player with the tag or the other kind of good quality HMG that has tried to put one of these things down and has just failed to do so for like 6 consecutive orders. It doesn't happen particularly often. There only are occasionally positions inside your deployment zone that enable you to do that. But it is a use that you can put these things to. Again, the overriding advice for these guys is they are your regular order pool and keep them safe. But sometimes you just need that long range ARO piece, and if you're going to do that, make use of the very long -3 range band on flash pulses. Now, a final note about flash pulse remotes, in addition to all of that, is that, as I mentioned, they have fairly variable AVA. one in many factions, two in others, three in some. Now, while one and occasionally two of these can be very valuable to free up points, be deployment zone repeaters, kind of be careful taking three of them if you are in a faction that has access to three. It isn't necessarily bad, and it can be a good fit for some lists, but don't just windmill slam three of them in as the first three models you add to a list, because ultimately, these are pieces that are fundamentally non-lethal. They aren't specialists, they can't accomplish mission objectives, and they can't kill the enemy. The contributions that they make to your battle plan are fundamentally just to support other things. And if you take three of them, that's a fifth of your force already that is locked into a non-offensive, non-mission oriented support role, which can be fine. But if you then take a bunch more pieces that are doing the same thing, like say we're playing Neo Terror and we take a couple of Fusiliers, one to be the lieutenant, okay, at that point that's five models, that's a third of our total list that are effectively non-combatants. And at that point, you start running into an issue where only a few casualties on important or key pieces can begin to unpick your ability to prosecute a game plan. You just want to be careful, basically. Having access to three of these is a strength of a faction. It's just something that you need to exercise judiciously. Don't let the fact that you can take multiples of them weaken an overall list just because you have access to them. Very useful pieces, an excellent contribution to every faction that they're in. Quite a few factions in the game would be really materially improved by going from AVA 1 to AVA 2, but usually two of them is the most that I would put in any given list, and one is more common. They are very valuable though, particularly as deployment zone repeaters and regular orders. They're just a little bit harder than you'd expect to kill. A fantastic addition to any faction. Up next, we have our baggage remotes. These are things like Camille's and Yaopu's and Salutes, etc. Now, unlike Flash Pulse remotes, these guys tend to have a variety of profiles. This is one on the screen now is the Salute Zond from Nomads, with kind of the core profiles that you'll associate usually with a baggage bot. And there are two that are important to this discussion around list construction. The first is the Deactivator Repeater, just for 8 points. The second is the Evo Hacker for 14 points and half an SWC, and with a few common features. All of them have baggage, all of them are Armor 2 and BTS 3, and all of them are Silhouette 4. Now, it's easy to look at the 8-point baggage bot and go, oh, this is just like another kind of Fugazi. This is a cheap regular order. And yes, to an extent, but I would discourage you from thinking about them that way and taking them for that purpose, because Silhouette 4 is much, much fatter than Silhouette 3. The amount of space that a Silhouette 4 model occupies is considerably larger. It is just about the biggest footprint on any model in the game, and if you take two Salute Zons or equivalent just to be orders, you will very quickly find yourself running out of deployment zone real estate, or putting them in positions where they're a little bit easier to kill than, for example, a Flash Pulse remote. And that's significant because, notwithstanding being Armor 2 compared to 0 on a Flash Pulse remote, they are much easier to kill than a Flash Pulse remote because they don't have Mimetism and they're only Phys 10, which makes them worse at dodging. And like Armor 2 is nice and it will occasionally save one that gets shot at, but it isn't as significant a defense as Mimetism, and we don't even really want our order-generating troops to be shot at all, and ultimately, because they're Silhouette 4, there's just a much higher chance that a baggage bot is going to end up in a position where it gets shot at than a Silhouette 3 prone Flash Pulse remote hiding somewhere safe. Now, despite that, even the Deactivator Repeater 8-point profile is very valuable to many lists because it has baggage, because it is still a regular order, yes, but it's 8 points for baggage, and baggage is just essential to some lists functioning. The ability to reload your unloaded weapons in the states phase for free, or even occasionally reload unloaded weapons as a short skill during play, during the order phase, is just massive in ensuring that you get value out of different troops. These might be things with pitchers or mines or other deployable weapons, even Panzerfaust, etc. Sometimes there's a good case to getting them reloaded. In Next Wave, for example, Blackhearts will actively fire off their Panzerfausts in active turn plenty of the time, and being able to reload those at turn end off your Ichadrons. Now, Ichadrons are a very different use case to Salute Zons. They are more expensive, they are kind of like baggage bots, but fundamentally a different kind of troop because they have flamethrowers and are 11 points but are Silhouette 2. You will almost always have two Ichadrons in a Next Wave list, and indeed you'll have one or two in many other combined army lists. But the basic point remains that tons of units in this game really want to be able to reload. And for that reason, one Salyut Zond or equivalent profile can just be a huge force multiplier. Any hacker, any other model with a pitcher, any model with a mine dispenser, even models with things like crazy koalas, disco balls are disposable and very valuable. Reloading is really, really good, so baggage is really, really good, and the cheapest way to get baggage into any list is with an 8-point Salyut or equivalent kind of remote. Now, the Evo Hacker also brings baggage and therefore is valuable, but is more of a specific use case. There are list niches that will want an Evo Hacker in, but you'll kind of know if your list wants an Evo Hacker. If you are running combat remotes, that's generally the use case. There are a series of programs that you can use the Evo Hacker basically as a buff spellcaster, for lack of a better term. It gives you a suite of hacking programs that provide various passive bonuses. The biggest and most common of those is the ability to grant marksmanship to any of your combat remotes, and there are quite a lot of combat remotes in the game that go from okay gunfighters to excellent gunfighters when you add marksmanship to them, but there are also a few other ones as well. You can give Fairy Dust, which is a firewall to any of a series of classes of troops, so you can give firewall to tags or hackers or remotes, or I think vehicles as well. That's an infinite range, basically anti-hacking buff. That can be very valuable. It's most valuable, I find, when you're running alpha hacking profiles that are also heavy infantry. So for example, in Combined Army again, you can use an E-drone. An E-drone is also kind of different to a Salyut because it has a gun and it's Silhouette 3. It is more expensive. But what you can do then is you can give a firewall to an anathematic by selecting heavy infantry as the target category for your fairy dust profile, your fairy dust program, and now your anathematic hacker, who is an absolute monster, also has a firewall and so can just face check enemy repeater areas. You can do the same thing in Operation Subsection with an Asura, for example, using the Operation Subsection version of the Evo hacker. Now, while we're talking about that, Operation Subsection is probably one of the most common use cases for an Evo hacker because it also has multiple linked combat remotes. So there will basically always be some kind of a use for an Evo hacker in Operation Subsection. Even then, though, I don't consider an Evo hacker mandatory. 14 points is relatively expensive for a non-lethal pure support piece. It costs an order to get those profiles, those hacking programs up, and it does cost half an SWC, which isn't free. It's a model that can be attacked by your opponent by firing pitches at your deployment zone and then using a killer hacker, which means it can be kind of vulnerable. And as a result, Evo hackers are a kind of sometimes food, but there are lists that make very good use of them. Maybe you want to buff your combat jump troops so that your combat jump troops can land more easily. Just go and look at the profiles that you can, the programs, goddammit, that you can use with an Evo hacker, and if any of those fit your lists, then you know that you can use an Evo hacker. The best use case for an Evo hacker obviously is making use of the baggage and making use of the program. An ideal companion, for example, might be something like a Rushi Mine Dispenser, where it benefits both from the baggage and from the marksmanship, for example, functioning as a force multiplier in multiple ways. Now, one thing to note is that, yes, we talked about the generic 8-point profile and the 14-point Evo hacker. Oh, what about that total reaction profile? No, don't take it. Just don't. Don't take the random janky Eugene FTO profiles either. The only two relevant baggage remote profiles are most of the time the 8-point baggage bot, the rest of the time the 14-point Evo. As soon as you try and make this profile do anything with regards to combat, anything that involves looking at your opponent, you start running afoul of the fact that it is Silhouette 4 and therefore difficult to deploy. Trying to make a 4-4 Silhouette 4 model work as a fire team option is a joke. Trying to make a total reaction combi rifle work at 17 points is just kind of a joke. Yes, theoretically, maybe you could force it in some cases, and yes, in Ariadna, there are a bunch of unique baggage remote profiles that actually have a variety of different utilities, including occasionally as total reaction pieces, but that Salyut with the total reaction combi rifle is a gulf away from being, for example, a total reaction Uragan, and even the Uragan is kind of a meme piece that you will use just occasionally. So just you can pretty safely ignore every profile on these baggage bot sets other than the 8-point baggage bot and the 14-point Evo hacker, but the 8-point baggage bot is just essential to some factions, and the Evo hacker is circumstantial but very useful in those lists that it fits. Don't treat these guys like generic 7-point order bots because they're just too hard to deploy to use that way, but do use them in any list that you expect to get benefit out of baggage. Up next, we have our forward observer remote, and here we start getting into perhaps slightly less ubiquitous in lists and more expensive, but still very valuable to have access to. These are your Pathfinders, your Weibings, your Stemplers, etc. Now, there can be a fair bit of variance between what factions have access to here. Hack Islam, for example, has got different weapon loadouts, including a Red Fury, but then a rifle and a light shotgun. Some factions will have Climbing Plus on theirs, but the big differentiator, and one of the best things to tell whether your faction should or shouldn't be using these, is if you have access to the tactical awareness profiles. Those are the big money, because unlike the other remotes we've spoken about so far, these kind of remotes need to spend orders to get value, but they can be very, very valuable if you have orders to spend on them, because they are just a package of utility that is an excellent supplement to many factions. Just to begin with, they are a fast specialist. They are 6-4 move, willpower 13, and a forward observer. In some factions, many Pan-Oceanian lists, for example, that's actually one of the best specialists that you have access to in terms of the ability to move forward and press buttons reliably. That by itself would be pretty useful, but then they also have just an excellent combination of tools. They have a sensor and a deactivator. That means that they can scan inside their zone of control, reveal camouflaged or hidden deployment things. That's very relevant in some missions. And then a deactivator can be used inside zone of control to safely disarm deployable weapons. Now, obviously against something like a Mad Trap, for example, it's going to trigger if you try and use the deactivator inside that range. But mines can often safely be deactivated inside zone of control by hiding behind a building, and even turning off enemy deployable repeaters. Yes, you'll prompt a hacking ARO, but you can turn those repeaters off through walls and safely clear the way for your important hackable pieces. And those are really valuable. Like, those are all really valuable things to do. And in some factions, you can even link these pieces. Some factions, mostly being Pan-Oceania, the Pathfinder Dronbot with tactical awareness being one of the best linkable troops in the entire game, and it's a wild card linkable model in many Pan-Oceanian profiles. You should just take those if you have access to them. Even if you don't have access to the linkability on these different pieces, if you have a tactical awareness forward reserve remote, it's often a very good addition to lists. In Yuching, for example, in like generic Yuching, we don't have the ability to link the Weibing Yao Kong, but we can just take it. And because generic Yuching tends towards lots of models that are really good in killing and fighting against the opponent, but maybe then has to stop and reorient towards pressing buttons in the midfield to actually accomplish the mission, a tactical awareness 6-4 model that can move forward. Maybe it moves forward 10 inches into a safe spot on the first turn. Just uses its tack aware for that. That's cool. Then a bunch of other stuff goes and fights. And then on the second turn, uses its tactical awareness order again to move forward, press a button. Maybe that takes 2 orders. One of them is tack aware. It's just a very efficient way of getting simple mission objective accomplished without degrading the rest of your force's ability to do whatever it is that they're looking to do. Really excellent, and on top of all of those different things, it's yet another model that is a repeater, which means that at deployment, it is contributing to that really useful deployment zone hacking network if you've got any hackers at all that can benefit from that. And then again, if we have access to the tactical awareness profile, we have a repeater that can reposition itself for free. So this is just an absolute package of complete utility. I played Ariadna for like a lot of the last few months. I very quickly began to just recommend to everyone that they put these things in lists because sensors with tactical awareness were a really good counter to a bunch of the tools that I had. Overall, an excellent piece if you have the tactical awareness profile, and not a bad one otherwise. Not really for gunfighting, even though it has a combi rifle and a flash pulse. Theoretically, you could use tactical awareness to put this thing in suppression, but most of the time you want it for its utility, and its utility is just very, very high. An excellent addition to any list that can take it if you have access to the tactical awareness one, and you don't otherwise have that utility some other way. And so, while perhaps not as much of an easy auto take as the first 7-point Flash Pulse remote as a very cheap regular order, or a baggage bot for lists that make any use at all of baggage, still very, very good to have access to and an easy fit into many lists. And in Pan-Oceania, where you can link the things, frankly, an auto include. Now, our fourth category of Universal Combat Remote is one whose fortunes and favor have kind of risen and fallen with time, which is the Total Reaction Remote. These are things like Shieras and Shihabs and Q-drones, etc. Relatively little variation between factions here. Usually what you're getting is a pretty similar profile, with the important features being Armor 0, which is not fantastic, but Ballistic Skill 11, a 360 visor, total reaction, and then either a heavy machine gun or a +1 burst thunderbolt. Heavy machine gun on, for example, a Shihad, costing 1 SWC and 23 points. The thunderbolt obviously having only burst 3 rather than burst 4, but being much cheaper at 0 SWC and 18 points. Other important skill here is remote presence and courage. We'll talk about why when we think about the overall role for this. Now, there's some differentiation between these remotes across factions, with the biggest ones being some factions have access to climbing plus on these pieces. Now that's relatively niche. It's usually a 1 point upgrade that you have to take if you're playing this model in those factions, but can open up some interesting offensive use by climbing up onto, for example, maybe a midfield or just outside your deployment zone, really elevated position your opponent didn't think you could reach, and getting some plunging fire. And then the other really significant unique profiles are, of course, in Combined Army once again, where the Q drone in Combined Army actually has access to a bunch of different profiles, but the big difference is that Combined Army have mimetism on Q drones, which is probably the best upgrade that you could possibly put on a model that is actually dedicated to ARO gunfighting. So the Combined Army Q drone is a real cut above, but otherwise fulfills basically the same role. And that is technically as a hard ARO piece, but I don't really think about it that way quite so much as I think about it as kind of a dedicated first casualty and something which your opponent is forced to engage before they otherwise go about their business. Usually, I will put something like this up in a maybe not watching every possible part of the table that I possibly could, but definitely watching longer fire lanes. Maybe I want to have it watching a cross map diagonal fire lane, or maybe I want to watch it just have it watch just wherever my opponent's impetuous pieces are. Because what I want this thing to do is fundamentally it's going to die or be knocked unconscious, more importantly, most of the turns that it's standing up, because burst 3 or burst 4 in reactive is really good, but ballistic skill 11 is ballistic skill 11 and it has no visors or no visual mods. Any dedicated firepower piece is going to put this thing down, but I want to force my opponent to put this thing down before they do anything else. And what that means is that the real role of something like a Shihab remote is to delay enemy advances while also being able to reconstitute, being easy to reconstitute. And that's where remote presence, like all of these remotes so far have had remote presence, but it's really relevant on a Shihab remote, because if we're taking this piece, we're taking it alongside the cheapest or perhaps most useful engineer that we can take, and we're relying on the fact that, yes, it's not too difficult for any decent, big quality gun to put a Shihab down in its active turn. Because the Shihab is firing 3 or 4 shots back, even if it loses the face-to-face roll, it's usually going to at least cancel a few of your opponent's shots, and if your opponent misses one shot and then I cancel one of the others and they're firing a HMG, well, the most that they're going to do is land 2 hits on me. And 2 hits can't kill a model with remote presence because you've got 2 unconscious levels. You might fail both of those saves, go unconscious 1, then unconscious 2, cool, next turn, 1 order, boom, bring this thing back up with a little helper bot or something. Maybe I have to spend a command token to re-roll the engineer roll. But the point is, I get this thing back up for 1 order, and my opponent then has to deal with it again on their next turn. Now, for that to be a good trade, it has to be 2 orders that your opponent spends to put this thing down, right? Just doing the math on this, if your opponent spends 1 regular order and knocks the Shihab unconscious, and you spend 1 regular order recovering it, that isn't actually a good trade, because you also lose a regular order because the Shihab is unconscious in your order phase. So ideally, you want to deploy or take engagements or just present these to your opponent in a way where they don't get to kill it in just the first order of their turn, but where after maybe 2 or 3 orders, yep, sure, they can put the Shihab down. You can't make this thing invincible. But if it takes your opponent 2 or 3 or 4 orders to knock the Shihab unconscious and you recover it in 1, at that point it's a good trade. It can still be a good trade even if they kill it on the first order or knock it unconscious in the first order of the turn, if you use it to discourage impetuous activations. So I mentioned McMurrough before. McMurrough and pieces like him, those kind of rapid offensive units, can be extremely scary closing in on your deployment zone. And they can be more scary if they are able to freely impetuous, because on a model like McMurrough, that can be 12 inches of forward movement. That can put him in striking distance with his irregular order as the first activation of your opponent's turn. And so putting a total reaction bot, heavy machine gun, or thunderbolt in a position where McMurrough, if he impetuous, would take shots from it, that's not an ideal face-to-face role for him. Yes, he could throw a smoke grenade or dodge on 16s, but you're firing off probably 3 or 4 dice on 14s yourself. He's at risk of taking wounds or dying if he does that. So usually, walking into a Total Reaction Bolt's ARO would discourage McMurrough from engaging a piece like this, and instead incentivize your opponent to not take his impetuous activation, which can be as good as stripping an order from your opponent while they wait to bring up their big guns and put him down. Maybe that's something like it's a Corregidor player and he throws some smoke with a Jaguar and then he shoots you with the Intruder. Now, an Intruder in that situation is probably putting you all the way unconscious in a single order, but even an Intruder with surprise and smoke shooting and you're hitting on neg 12s, so you have to dodge, even he is not likely to put you all the way to dead in one go. And that is effectively those 3 orders that we wanted to strip from our opponent to make this thing worthwhile. McMurrough didn't take his impetuous, and it took 1 order to throw smoke, and it took at least 1 order to put you down with an intruder. Good enough. We'll bring him back next turn, and we'll play this game again. Now, sometimes you even have a small miracle occur. Sometimes a Shihab or equivalent will actually score some kills in your reactive turn. Sometimes you'll roll a crit, because 3 or 4 dice is going to roll a crit occasionally, and your opponent will be like, oh, do I have to fight this thing all over again? Oh, I've taken wounds, or blah, blah, blah. If that happens, you consider it a bonus, but it can happen. In fact, with 3 or 4 dice, you've got a pretty reasonable chance to tie firefights or crit, and doing even a single wound with a total reaction bot in your reactive turn can be really good value because you didn't have to spend an order to do that. Now, despite that, these things are nevertheless very much a sometimes food in lists. And that is just because ultimately the quality of firepower that basically every faction has access to in N5 is very high. Every list that I have written, as I mentioned, for months now, has had the ability to pretty comfortably put one of these things unconscious at least during the active turn, which means that the role of the Shihab really is to be a dedicated casualty. That means it's going to go unconscious. That means you're going to be down 1 order at the beginning of your turn, down 2 orders if you intend to bring it back with an engineer. That's not a small impost in most lists and their ability to execute a plan. Now, you always need a plan to defend yourself in Infinity. You have to have a plan for surviving your first turn as reactive player if you're going second. But it is very important to think about all of the options that you might have to defend yourself if you're the second player, and only consider including a total reaction bot if it's actually the correct choice as part of your overall force mix. What else do you have that can be used to defend yourself? Do you have a good hacking network and close-in defense? Do you have other ablative models like Oxbots or even just cheap mine layers and warbands in the midfield? Do you have better quality hard ARO pieces that you'd prefer to use? For example, in Panoceania like Neoterra, for example, I'm unlikely to pick a Shihab or Sierra John bot in Panoceania because I have access to things like the Swiss Guard, which is just not just a Swiss Guard is not a dedicated casualty. A Swiss Guard will kill your opponent in their active turn. It is so high quality a reactive piece. So I will reach for other things before I reach for something like the Sierra in Panoceania. But some players rather do really like them. And they become particularly valuable if we are already including an engineer in our list. So for example, if you are a tactical armored gear player and you're running like a good quality tag with remote presence that you are intending to be able to repair, or perhaps you're running a vehicle, or perhaps you're running both. With a vehicle, you want access to a gizmo kit. Okay, cool, we took an engineer. Then at that point, 18 points for a Thunderbolt dude that might just save your ass on the first reactive turn if you're already taking an ability to reconstitute it. That can actually kind of be a low impost on an army, a low opportunity cost. 18 points is ultimately less than the 20-point average per model that we have to spend if we're running 15 troops. So even at 18 points, the Thunderbolt still frees up a couple of points to upgrade something somewhere else. And in those cases specifically, that can be very worthwhile. Overall, kind of as with all of these remotes, this is a piece, like just about every piece in Infinity, that you put in a list if you have a specific plan for it, But provided you have realistic expectations about what this model will accomplish when you put it into a list, and you kind of keep in mind that the minimum performance you usually want is just for it to die somewhat expensively to your opponent, can be very valuable, can be very worthwhile. I tend to include them only very rarely, but sometimes a list just needs a reactive gun, and a Shihab remote is all that there is. Finally, and historically the most contentious, we have guided missile remotes. These are things like Clippers, Millicents, Vertigos, T-drones, etc. They have a very simple purpose. It's to introduce guided missiles into a list. They really don't do much else. Most of the time, the profile that you're looking at is exactly like this one on screen now, which is the T-drone ballistic skill attack guided with a missile launcher. The only notable feature about it is that it's ballistic skill 12, as opposed to, say, ballistic skill 11 on some other remotes. The important thing is it's the only way for most factions to access ballistic skill attack guided. That's a very, very rare skill. Only an incredibly small number of other troopers have access to it, and so if you want to fire guided weapons at your opponent, usually this is how you get it. 1.5 SWC and 16 points is standard. 16 points is reasonably nice and cheap. 1.5 SWC is expensive, particularly if we're also adding in the infrastructure to target our opponent, which usually means one or more hackers, and those one or more hackers will have SWC costs themselves. So adding something like a T-drone and a bunch of hackers into our lists begins to build up in terms of SWC that we're spending. It means cutting other big guns out, but it can be very worthwhile. Usually in N5 for me, I actually decide whether to include guided missiles based on if I have already, for other reasons, included a bunch of hackers into a list. A good example is the Shinden Butai list that I've been playing recently, where Tanuki hackers are just fucking fantastic. They are excellent value, they are very high utility, they have ballistic skill 13, disco balls, and pitches. The fact that they have pitches means that they're getting their own network projection, and they are hackers. I'm taking them half the time for the disco balls, but it means that I have a linked ballistic skill 13 pitcher with a hacker behind it. In fact, I have two of those in most of my Shinden Mutai lists. That means it's kind of trivial for me to lay a bunch of pitchers into the midfield, which means I am regularly going to be declaring spotlights against my opponent in ARO, and I've got a ton of SWC in Shinden Butai because my lieutenant often has +1 SWC, meaning I've got 7 to spend. So hey, let's just put a guided missile remote in those lists. It's the ideal list for including to help me capitalize on all of the other tools that I already have. I will almost exclusively be spotlighting my opponent in reactive turn. It would only be very rare with a Shinden Butai list that I'd be trying for an active turn spotlight, because that way madness can lie. It can cost a lot of orders in your active turn to first lay the pitcher, then try and land the spotlight, then your opponent gets to reset, and if they succeed, they clear the spotlight. You can really toilet bowl away a turn going for active turn spotlight kills with low willpower hackers. But if you're getting those spotlights for free in your reactive turn, well, then spending one order out of Combat Group 2 in your active turn just to go for the missile shot is potentially high reward with relatively low risk. If your opponent resets against you and succeeds, no worries, you're done, that's it, we had a shot, one order was well worth spending. Now, a very rare number of lists in Infinity N5 can choose to play active turn guided missile play. And this is something that different people will have very different opinions on. My own personal perspective is that anyone who lets missile remotes live rent-free in their head and thinks that they are a really decisive part of any game probably relatively limited in terms of their understanding of how Infinity N5 works, but a very small number of lists can choose to make excellent active turn use of guided missiles as a primary offensive tool. These are things like, for example, Nomads with Interventor hackers, where you have an Interventor lieutenant. You have decent in Nomads, just decent network projection, but you have the free order from an Interventor being the lieutenant, and willpower 15 is very good. And then in Combined Army as well, we have access to some willpower 16 lieutenant hackers in Combined Army, things like an Anathematic or a Carontid. And in Combined Army, we have at least one decent quality pitcher thrower in the form of Bit and Kiss. And so in that kind of list, we can make potentially some use of active turn missiles just because of how reliable landing a spotlight with a willpower 16 surprise attack hacker is. Now, whether that would be my first choice for spending orders rather than spooling up a Mimetism 6 plasma rifle is definitely a question, but there's a time and place for active turn missile play. If you're playing against a faction that really you don't want to attack head on, If you've got a couple of spare orders at the end of a turn and you may as well go for the spotlight, those are the kind of use cases for active turn guided play. But overall, my general approach to guided missile remotes is to not build around them, right? Generally, I don't add the guided missile launcher in first, then add all the stuff to make it work. I add the guided missile launcher in last if I have all of the infrastructure already in place to take advantage of it. So the Shinden Butai example is perfect. All of those pieces I would put into a list already. Therefore, a guided missile remote in Shinden Butai can be an excellent return on investment, and it's not too expensive because I have the SWC spare. But in something like Pan-Oceania, for example, unless I was running, say, maybe military orders, and I began my list by adding in all of that good quality recently added missile military orders hacking, maybe at the very end of the list in military orders, I would consider adding a guided missile remote, but it wouldn't be the first piece I would add. I would never start a military orders list with a guided missile and then add in Defersen, unless I was specifically trying to meme or something. Still very useful to have access to in some lists. Just focus on adding them in as the 15th trooper if a guided missile remote is the 15th trooper in your list. That's often a sign that it's an excellent list to have included it in because you've taken care of everything else already and it's not sucking any oxygen or SWC, etc., away from other pieces. It's there to make occasional use of, and in those moments where it's good, it can be just very useful off of its merits rather than being something that you force. Now, just to note, in some factions, there will be non-guided profiles. Often they'll be linkable. Generally, these are pretty low value and well worth ignoring. Really, what we're here for with this kind of profile is the ability to access guided missiles. All of the other profiles you can basically ignore. Yep, sure, very occasionally there'll be some small use case for putting some kind of like supportware or something on a linked model, but in 98% of cases, those non-guided profiles can be disregarded. And that wraps up this video. Again, this has been a companion to the various different faction focus videos. If I don't cover in any given faction focus the generic remotes that the faction has access to, now it's because they're covered here. So again, big thanks to Shogun0099 for this video suggestion. You are by no means the only person to have requested this. This is actually something that's been mentioned a couple of times as a useful companion video to the faction focus videos, but this was a good push to finally get around to it, and I'm very happy to have recorded this. Again, as a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, go ahead, click like, click subscribe, all of that YouTube metric stuff, and you can support the channel either via the Buy Me a Coffee link on the video description below, or by becoming a member on YouTube. There's also, these days, an affiliate link to the Corvus Belli web store in the video description below. It may even be working at time of recording. Otherwise, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.